it's a bit strange for me to introduce Ilija to a Viennese audience, but given the fact that I should be doing my duty as his host, I'm going to say a few words about him. And it's an especial pleasure for me because Ilija and I have been friends since many, many years. I think since we did a talk show, the Philosophen Sternstunde, together in Zurich. We've done quite a few events together, either together or me introducing Ilija, once Ilija interviewing me in Vienna. So actually, this is a road show which has had many incarnations. But in the latest incarnation, it's Ilja's book that I would like him to talk to you about tonight, and that is his book on development, on aid in times of crises and the crises of aid. As you know, aid has had a very bad press over the last years, with most people making the argument that development aid of the last 5 decades has brought nothing at all and has had more of a detrimental effect than done any good anywhere. What Ilija does in the book is to turn the tables on this absolute skepticism about the nature of aid as an instrument, showing what are the conditions under which it makes sense to provide development aid to communities who are then able to use it to do something positive, to change their lives, to empower themselves, and towards their own well-being. So there has been a huge debate, as you know, also on questions of solidarity, on distribution, about the nature of the financial system in which we live, which is not particularly conducive to solidarity or redistribution. There has been a lot of focus on the efficiency of aid, on the resilience of community, etc. And Ilja's empirical work, so here he turns to become an anthropologist, which is something he gave up many years ago, much to my disappointment as a fellow anthropologist. Ilija studied law and anthropology at the University of Munich, for those of you who do not know that. Gave up and became an essayist, an author, writer, a translator, and also a publisher. So in this book, he goes back to being a good anthropologist and has done research in a dozen countries on 4 continents, and he's looking at positive examples of how aid can work in circumstances in which it is able to shape positively the lives of those who are being helped. Very briefly, for those of you who do not know all of Ilja's work, I'll only mention 3 or 4 major works quickly. Ilija founded the Kirill and Methoden Verlag in 1989 and then the Marino Verlag in 1992, both of which specialize interestingly on African literature because he has an affinity to the continent, having grown up in Kenya for many years after having left Bulgaria with his family in 1972. He writes regularly for the FAZ, for the Süddeutsche, for NZZ. And of course, he is extremely well known in Vienna as somebody who not only is there presenting books as an author, but he's also been doing in the Volkstheater with us, IWM as a partner, the Rote Salon, and I hope that's a cooperation which is going to continue. His first book was on Africa, Mythos und Alltag Ostafrikas, in 1993, from the time of his travels there, but Ilija has lived in India as well, and has written extensively on his experiences in India. There's a wonderful book on Calcutta and the books and booksellers in Calcutta. There is also a book on Along the Ganges, which I can recommend to you very highly. From India, Ilija traveled to Mecca. So there is a wonderful book called Mumbai to Mecca, which is also translated into English. He writes both in German and in English. A lot of the work is translated into 30 different languages. The two in English which have probably got the most attention have been The Collector of the Worlds, Weltensammler, and The Lamentation of Zeno. So I'm just going to stop with this by mentioning that Ilija has picked up almost all the prizes that can be awarded to one in the literary world. The Leipzig Book Fair Prize for the Weltensammler, the Karl Emery Literature Prize, the Usedom Literature Prize, the Heinrich Böll Prize, and finally the Ehrenpreis des österreichischen Buchhandels für Toleranz in Denken und Handeln, which shows you something of the spectrum of Ilija's intellectual engagement, which has always been also a very strong political engagement. And I think that is something which this book shows in an exemplary fashion. So Ilija is our fellow at the moment. He has been in India while on his fellowship here. We missed seeing each other in India last week. So it's wonderful that both of us are back in town.
Thank you very much, Shalini. Good evening. It's a little bit weird to speak in English in Vienna, my first time. To make it easy for those of you who read German, you can actually go home and buy the book. All I'm going to say is, in this book, I have to say the book was co-written by with Thomas Gebauer. And I just have to quickly introduce him. He is the head of a very good NGO, as I think, called Medico International. And he's actually a Nobel Prize winner for peace. He was one of the two initiators of a very successful campaign against landmines. That was actually, we also covered this in the book. I'm not going to speak about this tonight. But it was a very positive example how a campaign that is well organized and has kind of a conceptual political approach can be extremely successful, one of the most successful campaigns that I know of. So just to give you a little bit of a background, Shalini mentioned we traveled around the world in 2017 and 18. We were in the rainforests of Guatemala, we were in the textile factories of Pakistan, we were in the slums of Nairobi, we were in the mining sector of Sierra Leone, which is as close to hell as exists on this planet. We were with refugees in Mexico, we were with revolutionaries in Chiapas, we were with human rights activists in Nicaragua. But we were also with places like the AidX in Brussels, which is the biggest aid fair on the planet. And if you want to understand something about how poverty can be good business, just go to Brussels. It's a yearly event. And it's absolutely amazing how many companies, meanwhile, focus on the very, very profitable area of relief and aid and help. And we also spoke mostly in Germany with a number of people in the industry, people in NGOs, and politicians. So this was the research. The premise was that both of us have been aware of a rather dramatic situation the last few years, which is defined by two very opposed developments. One is that the need for emergency relief, particularly, has exploded. And the last 2 years, several high-ranking UN officials have actually stated that the institutional capacities of the UN, for example, the World Food Programme, is by far outstripped by the growing need for dramatic emergency relief. So they're just not keeping up with the enormous kind of quantity of drought victims, war victims, and so on. And the other thing is that, as Shalini mentioned, aid in its traditional form as development aid, which means as something that is organized in a kind of hierarchical, top-down, patriarchal, paternalistic way, has been for about 5-6 decades since many of these countries became independent. This aid has now a really bad name. There are many, many stories about white elephants, Norwegians building factories to process fish in northern Kenya without bothering to find out whether the local people called Turkana actually eat fish. Stories like that abound, anecdotal evidence of something actually very, very simple, and that is that one would have thought that the easiest approach to development aid would be to ask the local people what they need and how they want to go about changing their lives. This was very often not done. So we don't actually look at this in our book at all, because I think it's been discussed widely, satirically, polemically. I think everything has been said. What we're looking at is how aid has changed the last few years, and it has changed in a way that is, we believe, terrifying. Terrifying because there are several phenomena which in a way are impediments to any form of profound social change. One is what we call refeudalization, and I'll explain this in detail later. The other is depolitization. A third one is a very popular phenomenon now called resilience. For those of you who don't know about resilience, the best way to explain is that people in Bangladesh who have chickens were asked to get rid of the chickens and to invest in livestock that can swim because of climate change. The water levels are going to rise, and therefore they actually need animals that can swim, for example, ducks. So resilience, translated in the language of an author, of a novelist, is exchanging chicken for duck. What we looked at in these 12 countries we visited was what are actually the parameters of aid that allow for a transformative change. And the interesting thing was that, number one, we found a lot of encouraging positive examples. Number two, that the parameters are, regardless of the cultural context, the social-political context, the regional context, are actually quite similar. And it's not rocket science. It's a question of certain attitudes, certain logistical frameworks, and I will give you a number of examples. So let me start. Actually, the interesting thing about this project is sometimes, and as a novelist, this is something that has happened very often to me, sometimes reality actually is your best partner, your best helper. So we arrived the very first day in Karachi in Pakistan, and we were invited immediately, basically just had time to change, to an event, an art exhibition, Pakistani young artists against hunger. And it was financed by the Swiss, so the Swiss Consul General gave a speech, and then the local representative of the UN gave a speech and said, we will solve all the problems because, as you know, we have now decided that by 2030, through the so-called SDGs, Sustainable Development Goals, we will overcome hunger, underdevelopment, gender and social inequality, and so on. There are 18 educational deficits and so on, 18 points in these SDGs. And therefore, her optimism was great, but it was also quite prolonged, so people got a little bit bored and started drinking at the bar. Of course, she didn't mention the means of implementation. The means of implementation are in a very, 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 very tiny font. They're quite boring, so you have to read through them to find out. that this policy, which is called Leave No One Behind, sounds like something invented by a politician, Leave No One Behind means that each nation state is in charge of its own development, and the financing of this development will have to be done through economic growth. There's absolutely no talk of any global redistribution, and there's no talk, for example, of getting rid of debts. A small aside, it's been fascinating to see that both the Austrian, the German, and the EU politicians recently have discovered this wonderful idea which is called the Marshall Plan for Africa. And everybody is touting it, but no one actually seems to realize what the real Marshall Plan consisted of. And one of the major pillars of the Marshall Plan was actually to write off all the debts, the huge debts of the German state. And that was specialists, I haven't looked into it, but I read a few books on this question. Specialists seem to agree that without this, the Marshall Plan would never have been as successful as it was. Under the UN SDGs, there's absolutely no talk of writing off the debts of especially African countries, but also Asian and Latin American countries. Anyway, this was the situation, and of course there was a wonderful buffet with food that the Pakistanis didn't really care for, raclette and spätzle and stuff like that. So the bar was popular, the buffet was not popular. But next to the buffet, there were 3 young people with T-shirts. And it said on the T-shirt, Robin Hood Army. And we were intrigued, so we went to talk to these 3 young people. And they said, yes, this is a very successful new NGO. It was started just 2 years earlier, but it now has 40 outlets in Southern Asia. And what they do is they go to events like this one, events at which people talk about how they will overcome hunger. And they are given at the end of the evening all the remains from the buffet, and they distribute it in the slums of Karachi, in to other poor people throughout Southern Asia. So we had this really wonderful discussion with them, because at some point I asked them whether they knew who Robin Hood was. And they said, yes, absolutely. And I asked them whether they actually think that Robin Hood would have attended a function or a buffet, an orgy at the Sheriff of Nottingham Forest, and whether he would have waited for them to finish their dinner before he then left with a few half-eaten chicken to distribute to the poor people in the forest. And they agreed, no. They agreed that Robin Hood would have never done that. But the really interesting thing was that they agreed that what they're doing would have no transformative influence. They were not naive in any sense of the word. And when we asked them, but why are you doing it? They said something that I think is at the core of the problem and at the core of this book. They said, because this can be successful, while true social political transformation has no chance of success. So they were actually engaged in political activism of small steps without any form of vision that this can lead to what they actually were striving for, which is overcoming hunger. So in a nutshell, we had the whole problem and the whole kind of narrative framework of the whole book in Karachi on the very first evening. So the next day we went into the Sindh province, and to me it was a kind of homecoming, because a part of the novel Collector of Worlds is set in the Sindh, because Richard Burton, on whose life the novel is based, lived a few years in the Sindh. And the Sindh is called the Sindh because the biggest river of Pakistan, the Indus, runs through it. And 2010, there was a huge, huge flood. You might remember it from the news. It was a really absolutely disastrous event. Millions of people were driven from their lands. And it was one of these huge international relief efforts. And we visited 2 villages, and one was called Tulsidas, which, as Shalini would know, means that it is one of the few villages still inhabited by Hindus in a predominantly, of course, Islamic society. And the other one was called Mehrampur. And these 2 villages were the exact opposite of what aid can achieve. In both cases, the people were driven from the land. They went onto small hillocks. At some point, they received food, tents, blankets. They survived. Of course, the first step of relief is to make sure people survive. And then after a few weeks, they could go back to their villages. The villages, of course, being completely destroyed. In the case of Tulsidas, they received the usual form of aid, which means, for example, solar lights, so that they could at least use something for, because there was no electricity in the village after sunset. And they received a certain material support, but nothing else. So they were caught in this vicious circle between existing feudal structures and a Pakistani state that is basically involved in a form of re-feudalization, oligarchy, mafia, and the army building a nexus which is of the highest exploitative and corrupt form imaginable. The other village was completely different. And what I'll never forget is that when we entered the village, we actually saw that the people, the way they walked, the way they talked, the way they greeted us, the people were different. You could actually see the dignity of transformative change in their behavior. Because it was comparatively an affluent village, and the reason that it was affluent was the following. This particular village was reconstructed with the help of a, we believe, very good Pakistani NGO called HANDS. And the idea of HANDS is that catastrophe can actually be a chance. So because of the utter destruction of the existing, the concept of HANDS is to say, okay, let us take this as an invitation for a complete restructuring of the village. So let us come up with a kind of utopian concept of what a village should look like in order to empower all the people living in the village, which means, of course, the women, which means, of course, having some form of commons, some form of communal economic interest, which means, of course, having something like a small hospital, which means, of course, having a primary school, which means having, for example, small workshops so that the women could do something that is actually very profitable in countries like Pakistan, and that is wedding clothes. Because as you know, even in the poorest countries, when there's a wedding to celebrate, people spend all their money, whether they have it or not. So this concept of restructuring, and this is one of the most important aspects, was not undertaken by someone from Karachi or someone from the outside planning it and then handing it over to the villagers. It was done in a deliberative process together with the villagers, who formulated what they needed, and together in something that I would call kind of very simple democratic discourse, they came up with different forms of, let's say, social investment that would allow the whole village to prosper. For example, to have a rickshaw that would belong to the village. Therefore, if there was a necessity to quickly, let's say someone is ill, to quickly get them to the nearest town, to the hospital, they would have a rickshaw, of course, if they needed to transport something. So things that each aspect was not particularly revolutionary and was not particularly kind of dramatically innovative, but as a whole, the village was transformed in a way that was absolutely fascinating. There was a radical restructuring of the village. So this was the first really kind of positive example that inspired us. And it was very necessary because the rest of the time we spent in Karachi looking at the textile industry. And that is seriously grim, but I'm not going to go into that. If you're interested, it's in the book. So coming back from Pakistan, we realized that the first thing we need to look at is the conflict between human rights and aid. Because what we already saw in Pakistan, in conjunction with the worst industrial fire in the history of mankind, it was a factory in Karachi which was burnt to the ground, and about 260 people died inside. They died a horrific death because the doors were closed. The doors were closed because the owner claimed that otherwise they would steal from the factory. The efforts by many people involved to actually bring the people responsible to court were a complete and utter failure. So in the end, we spoke to the leading human rights lawyer in Pakistan. At the end, there was a small compensation by the biggest German company, actually, that was having stuff produced there called Kick. I don't know whether you know the company. It's basically the cheapest form of clothes that you can get. Nearly everything on offer is between 5 and 10 euro. So they paid 5 million, but there was beyond that, they were not successful in translating the court case into kind of a new parameter for workers' rights, for safety issues in the factory, for any kind of framework that would guarantee that something like that would not happen again. This problem came up time and again, especially in Africa. Wherever we went in Africa, we noticed something that I would call kind of the general law of neoliberal capitalism, and that is investment rights always trump human rights, always. And you realize that when you see something that is called land grabbing, where it both within the country, whether it's Sierra Leone or Ethiopia, just to give you two examples of countries where land grabbing is massive. In Sierra Leone, it's actually, meanwhile, 30% of the arable land, that the people who own the land basically have no rights. Interestingly enough, one of the reasons they have no rights is that they did not have individual rights traditionally, they had communal rights. So the land that they were using did not belong to them in the kind of Western individual concept. They did not have a title deed. What they had was an old traditional, what they call customary law, which allowed them to use this land. And of course, since the land is communal, it is under the control, at least kind of legally, by someone called the tribal chief. Of course, that's a colonial name that's still being used, colonial title. So the tribal chief can actually sell the land, and they have no chance, no recourse to the law, neither nationally nor internationally. And the interesting thing is that within the work of the UN Human Rights Council, for 4 decades now, different NGOs, different activists have been trying to come up with some kind of binding treaty that links investment business with human rights. And one would think that there would be a great majority to counter, through such a legal framework, the human rights abuses, the massive daily human rights abuses of multinational companies. But that is not the case at all. Actually, these deliberations are being sabotaged also by most of the EU countries. bizarrely enough, at the very last meeting, which was I think last summer, the German government sent an intern to the discussions. So we looked at the way people are trying to overcome this deficit. And that was also a very interesting experience, because we realized that the first step in establishing human rights is actually informing people that they have rights. And that was very clear in the case of an organization of very young people. They were mostly between 25 and 30, working in the slums of Nairobi. Because they're all paralegals, and their concept is that you cannot actually have any form of established of a landscape of established human rights unless you have first an educational process of informing people that they have rights. And they gave us very endearing, I would say, moving, touching examples of people actually having to be told that they, as an individual, embody something like the concept of universal human rights. And that in itself, this kind of educational process was of great significance, because in some cases that gave the people in the slums, who of course are marginalized on nearly all levels, gave them the idea and then of course the courage to say, okay, in what way can I then seek regress in the many, many cases of their human rights being violated. This was very interesting, because this was one of the few examples where we saw an approach in which a political kind of a politicization of the aid activity was part of the concept. What we saw in most other cases was the exact opposite, a very systematic depoliticization, which means it starts off with the fact that the whole discourse is defined by economic terms. Terms like efficiency, rentability, basically the projects, the concepts, the evaluations read like something you might study if you're doing economics 101. To give you an example, Chiapas, South Mexico, is dominated by an American foundation that's called Kellogg. Those of you who eat this horribly sweet stuff in the morning probably know what they produce. And Kellogg has, in a very, very wily way, completely depoliticized the whole NGO sector in Chiapas. Number one, as one activist told us, they have drowned us with money. What happens when money comes in is that money, of course, you become dependent on money. And if as a small NGO you are working towards projects that you're convinced of, that you've kind of both emotionally and idealistically internalized, you don't want the money to go away. But the moment you take money from a huge foundation like Kellogg, and it's more money than, in many cases, than you expected, than you had, than you even dreamt of, that money defines the freedom of your activity. Number one, you become dependent on the money. The next year, in order to receive the same amount of money, you are then asked to follow certain parameters of what the Kellogg Foundation regards as being reasonable development aid. And what follows is that in all these discussions with the donor, in this case the Kellogg Foundation, and all the different people who are working as, for example, health promoters, which means people who have a basic education in healthcare and who go into villages where there's absolutely no healthcare, and they perform very simple procedures, and they inform people about kind of the holistic concept of health, which means good life, good food, and how to avoid illness. That previously, the discussions were defined also by coming up with long-term political visions, alternatives to the ruling system, alternatives to the structures that are in place. While now, and the Kellogg Foundation seems to be a very kind of dramatic expression of this, the political discourse is not only frowned upon, it's in a way stigmatized. So no one wants to talk about what many of us would regard as true transformative change, but everybody wants to talk about the technological approach to project-driven kind of narrow-mindedness, which becomes kind of the new grammar of interacting with donors, and then, of course, the new grammar of, in a form, self-censorship, because you cannot go beyond these boundaries if you do not want, if you want to receive money in years to come. This is something that, I'll just give you one example. This is something that we came across everywhere, not only in countries like Mexico, but also in Germany. There is a huge now institution called Fina, which is set up by someone who, that's another really interesting thing. You come across an enormous amount of people who used to work for organizations, companies like McKinsey. It's really interesting. These, and McKinsey now is just the chiffre for people like that. The McKinsey people are everywhere, and the McKinsey people, we had interviews with several of them. The McKinsey people speak in a very weird language of efficiency. Everything is about efficiency. And to give you an example that to me as a novelist was particularly striking, they really love kind of Excel-driven analysis of what is efficient and what's not efficient. So one of their examples, because it was a study that was well funded and it was quite a big study, is from Africa, and they compared 3 different projects. One is an American project in Kenya called Give Directly, which is a very, very simple idea. You give people money, the simplest idea. So, by the way, how did they find out whether someone really needs money? They took, that is also interesting. It's always high-tech driven. So these people are really, really into high-tech. They will talk about the Gates Foundation later. These fellows are also believers in high-tech. So they took aerial shots of villages, and they found out that if you have a corrugated iron roof, you at least are a little bit affluent. If you still have a kind of thatched roof, you belong to the poorest in the village, therefore you need money. So every month you receive a certain payment. I believe it was about $20. So that's the one project. Very, very easy to prove through the wisdom of Excel that this has a positive economic impact, correct? I mean, it's very simple. They have $20, so therefore the kids can now go to school, because in many of these countries you have to have school uniforms. They can now become consumers on the lowest entry level of the marketplace. And of course, sometimes they can even make a small investment in something that might improve their economic and financial situation. The second project was in Burkina Faso, West Africa, shooting films for on health, so kind of health awareness documentaries, shown on national TV. Slightly more difficult to prove how effective they are, but at least to some extent you could show that certain indices, certain numbers regarding health issues in Burkina Faso had improved. For example, of course, the simplest of improvements, AIDS rates go down because you have a massive information campaign regarding how to, informing people how to prevent getting AIDS. Now the third thing is, and this is now really interesting, is a program in several West African countries, mostly Ghana and Nigeria, which donates books to the school libraries. Now, how efficient do you think that is? According to the McKinsey fellows, this is the worst possible project you could ever do because they could not find any economic data to show that this has any positive impact whatsoever. And of course, I mean, how can you possibly prove that a 17-year-old Ghanaian who reads Tolstoy will improve his economic status? You just can't prove it. And therefore, according to this study, to my great dismay, giving books to school libraries is just a waste of money, waste of time. Don't do that. Give the guy $20, then if he really wants to, he can buy himself Tolstoy. So these McKinsey fellows, one of them is now head of Fina. Fina has an enormous amount of money because they're linked with Bertelsmann Foundation, which is the biggest and wealthiest German foundation. And they have the money of a woman called Susanne Klatten, who is the wealthiest German, at least the wealthiest German woman. And they define aid, again, in exactly these terms that I mentioned. They believe that in order for an aid project to be viable, it has to come up with a kind of an economic sheet that is the same as in a company. So basically the idea is that whatever is good for a company, a certain kind of profitability, rentability, and all these aspects, the same thing has to apply for an aid project, which means, of course, that anything like human rights is irrelevant because there's absolutely no way to translate human rights, awareness of human rights, education about human rights into numbers. It's just not possible. Since I mentioned the Gates Foundation, in Sierra Leone, while we were there, while we were traveling through Sierra Leone, probably the most important and certainly the favorite campaign of the Gates Foundation was taking place, and that is fight against polio. And it was amazing to see that the logistical organization was truly amazing. It was really impressive. In every village, they had organized for a weekend, and there were big signboards everywhere. Everybody was informed as to who was to turn up at what time and so on and so forth. So in terms of kind of the logistical organization, it was as good as it gets. But the problem, of course, is that let us assume it is as successful as planned. After a year or 2 or 5, polio would have been or would be eradicated in Sierra Leone. The problem is that in all these villages we went to, there's absolutely nothing beyond the 5th and 6th October campaign against polio. There's absolutely no other health service whatsoever. So there's no way such a technological approach defined by efficiency would help in constructing a system that actually guarantees health. Because health is so much more than, of course, the absence of illness. Health is all these, as you all know, all these social, psychological, economical, and cultural aspects that make a human being whole. And none of these projects that these big foundations actually support have this holistic approach of organizing something like a functioning health system, for the very simple reason that the very narrow focus on privatized interventions, of course, does not allow for something like that. Something like the universal health system, as you know, Austria, Germany, other countries, of course, can only be done within the framework of the whole society, thus institutionalized, universal, and not kind of single issue driven and technological. But let's come to the second positive example. We've had too much negativity now. And interestingly enough, I'm asked time and again, what can we actually learn from the others? When you're a kind of professional traveler, that's one of the things you get asked. And this is an example that I would like to quote also in future. In Sierra Leone, we found out that they have come up with something called the Citizens Manifesto. And the way they did it was that all, or not, maybe not all, but many of the well-organized NGOs and activists in civil society throughout the country started inviting people to meetings on the local level, on the regional level, discussing with anybody who wanted to come. Usually about 80 to 100 people came, discussing the priorities people had in regard to social and political change. And from the local level, it would go up to the regional. Again, they would have some kind of representative regional meeting. This then led, after 1.5 years, to a national convent. And they defined a national citizens manifesto that clearly formulated what people expected. And probably doesn't come as a surprise to you that it's quite progressive. And in some instances, it's quite radical. For example, in terms of gender equality, it's absolutely as progressive and radical as it could possibly be. And I found that very interesting because time and again, we actually also in our societies get a notion that actually the population in some respects is far more progressive than the political space and the political discourse. But anyway, this manifesto was formulated, was published, and is now being used as kind of a stick with which civil society drives the political space. So basically, all these organizations, all these activists are using it as kind of a Bible of good intentions, forcing politicians to swear by it, in parentheses, forcing this to become kind of a framework for a new political debate. And I found that very interesting because highly developed societies don't have that. What we have is 1,222 people being called by interns and asked how do you feel about nuclear energy, and then we find out that 56% are for and 37% against, and 17% are undecided. It's kind of always 70% that are undecided. So this kind of very dubious way of trying to gauge the public opinion seems to me to be less efficient than the Citizens Manifesto. So coming back to Europe after Sierra Leone, one of the things we looked at after encountering the polio campaign of the Gates Foundation was actually the way these big foundations, and Gates is, I think, the biggest, how they have hijacked the political discourse. This whole thing, by the way, is called philanthrocapitalism, which is a really funny name. It's, I don't know whether you like Monty Python as much as I do, but there's certain words, when I hear them, I have this yearning for the rebirth of Monty Python. And I think to myself, what would they have done with philanthrocapitalism? Philanthrocapitalism basically means that the ill-gotten gains of these people are then translated into power, into decision-making, and this is what we call refeudalization. Because someone like, for example, Bill and Melinda Gates have an enormous power. Just to give you a sense of the power they have, their health budget is as big as the budget of the WHO. It is unbelievable. Because of that, they can actually define, manipulate universal health policies. They are extremely influential within the WHO. Because of their huge investments in pharma industry, they are hugely influential in defining the framework of the pharma industry. For example, of course, defending patents by financing these huge campaigns in which they actually pay the going market price for a certain medicine, which of course means that another approach, an approach, for example, that both the Indian and the South African movements partly were successful in achieving, that is coming up with their own medicine that is far, far, far cheaper and that thus can be far more easily made available to every citizen. That, of course, is sabotaged by this approach. The second thing is the so-called matching funds. The Gates Foundation, like all big foundations, basically promise that if you, as a government, as an international body, if you invest a certain amount, that they will match this amount, which of course means that the projects that are then massively funded are projects that are to the liking of foundations like the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. Now, this philanthrocapitalism has led to something that is quite new and that is now the big craze in the whole aid industry. And that is basically combining, to put it very bluntly, the word social with all forms of capitalist nomenclature. So it's either social bonds, social business, social investment. If you get tired of the social, you can add humanitarian. So sometimes it's humanitarian impact investment. And what it means is that you can actually make money out of aid. And the way it works, just to give you an example, is the Red Cross in Switzerland. So the Red Cross in Switzerland, not very long ago, actually, about a year ago, slightly more than a year ago, it didn't have the necessary funding to build 3 factories in Africa for artificial limbs. So they came up with this humanitarian impact investment, which means that if you're prepared to invest in this particular project of the Red Cross Switzerland, you are promised that if certain achievements, certain aims are met, which are defined in this case by the number of artificial limbs that will be produced in a certain year, then you will receive 6%. Which is, as you know, higher than what the banks currently pay. So it's a good investment. If they do not achieve it, then, and this is the really interesting thing, the Swiss state guarantees you at least the money that you've invested. So it's truly a win-win situation for the humanitarian investors. The Red Cross was criticized heavily for this, and their defense is noteworthy. The Red Cross says that they are forced to engage in this kind of reaching out to the financial marketplace because they do not have the funds. And not having the funds, they are basically, they're stuck between 2 bad options: not to build these factories at all, or to use private money of private investors to at least make sure that that this particular project is realized. The problematic thing, besides, of course, the fact that in a way the state is enabling against capital to make wins on something that should not be part of profit making at all. The other really problematic thing is the way success is defined, because you can well imagine that there's more to overcoming the problem of people that miss a foot, a leg, or an arm, than the number of artificial limbs produced. What, of course, is necessary is the adaptation of the limbs to the people's adaptation with the limbs back to a normal life, the reintegration of these people into, for example, jobs or other forms of social interaction. And interestingly enough, these things which seem evidently existential to judging the success of such a project, these factors are not looked at all. So the only thing that's looked at is a little bit similar like the Tolstoy in the Ghanaian library. Things that cannot be measured, cannot be of importance, basically. If you're interested in the subject, there's a lot in the book. I'm going to stop here because it's a huge subject. I think it suffices to say that this is a dramatically exploding financial market at the moment. Huge, and that actually you meanwhile have investors conferences where people are told that this is, Africa, and aid in Africa is the next big thing, forget about mining. Mining aid is even more profitable. Coming back to something positive, the third really fascinating positive thing we came across was, how do you transform victims into social activists? And we came across this in all the countries we visited. Just to give you an example, Mexico, as you all know, is it's a country with many, many problems. One of them being that you have these migration routes that go through Mexico, because the two most violent countries in the world at the moment are Honduras and El Salvador. These people, these refugees are, again, by the way, small, in brackets, again, there's so much money to be made out of suffering. It's really amazing. I didn't know it costs about $2,000 to $3,000 to get from the southern border of Mexico to the northern border. So you can imagine how many, and we're talking about quite a number of people fleeing, how much money is made. And interestingly enough, being a refugee is far more expensive than being a normal citizen, because I calculated that for this very same route, so from the south of Chiapas to, let's say, El Paso or Tijuana or whatever, you would actually have to pay $100, $150, depending on whether you travel by train or by bus, while the refugees are paying $2,000 to $3,000. And there was a map in this border town near the border with Guatemala. There was a map that was one of the most impressive things I've ever seen. It was a map that consisted only of symbols where you would have to pay and where you would be threatened. So the symbols were a pistol or a dollar sign, and the railway lines and the road lines that move through Mexico were shown on the map, and all kind of the points of interaction with either corruption or violence were marked. So in a way, the refugees coming into Mexico were given a sense of what lies ahead, both in terms of the money they would have to part with and the violence they might encounter. Violence both, of course, on the side of the state, so police, and of the side of narcotic mafia groups. the interesting thing is that many of these refugees become victims, and the man who is in charge of this, called L72, of this kind of both refugee camp and activist center, was doing the following. He was trying to convince people who became victims of violence or of corruption to stay in Mexico and to fight whatever happened to them, by claiming victimhood as an opportunity for social activism or political rebellion. And he was saying that, of course, many people refuse. Of course, many people are traumatized, or they have only the urge to, in some way, overcome their predicament. But when it works, he gave us the example, for example, of a group of men on the railway lines being attacked. One of them was shot dead, and then because they were close friends with this man, they said, okay, we're going to stay here, we're going to take this to court, we're going to fight, we're going to inform people, and so on and so forth. And he said that the interesting thing is, once you transform a victim into a social activist, this becomes actually a sustainable form of rebellion, because some of these people then, after a certain period of time, made it into the US, and then there again, they were not happy with being, happy in parentheses, with being illegal workers, but they actually immediately sought out opportunities for political engagement. And another social activist told me actually the best sentence that I heard on all our travels. He says, help? No, we don't need help. Common struggle? Yes. So the solidarity that, of course, lies kind of, the empathy and solidarity, that's kind of, I would say, the ethical and emotional backbone of this question, leads, I think, to a solution that is very clear and yet very difficult to come about, and that is that, in a way, there has to be a transformation towards some kind of common cause. And whenever that happens, whenever that was possible, for example, in the Mathare Valley slum in Nairobi, it was actually then reasonably successful in repealing the violence of the police. Interestingly enough, exactly these solutions that I think are very, very effective, also long-term effective, are not discussed within the framework of the current kind of philantro-capitalistic, efficient aid movement at all. They're kind of words like solidarity, redistribution, and all these other words that I used just now do not exist in the dictionary of this kind of other movement. Which is defined basically, I would say, by crisis management. It's defined by a pragmatic realism. And it's defined, and this is something that's also becoming more and more extensive throughout the world, by a phenomena that we call securitization, which means that if you cannot solve a problem, at least make sure that it doesn't affect the whole society. So basically, invest in security. Private security business is booming. It has growth rates of worldwide of about 65 to 70%. Misha Glenny, who was here actually last month, I had a beer with him, and he was telling me that the private intelligence, which is kind of part of the private intelligence, meanwhile, makes up for about 80% of intelligence throughout the world. So actually the state actors are employing private intelligent actors because they're no longer capable of coming up with all the necessary information. So in a way, this is very similar, even in health. And the example we describe in the book is the Ebola crisis, which is really a devastating example, because you realize that the dystopian solution to something like Ebola was security. That was the only solution they came up with. Basically quarantines and police cordons that I'll never forget how we spoke to a woman that was in the village and everybody around her died and nobody could leave because the army had surrounded the village, and she was the last person who survived. For some miraculous reason, she survived Ebola. But because no one was allowed in and no one was allowed out, people that she knew would come right up to the army cordon, and they would scream and shout across to find out who was still alive, and then they kind of made a mental note of the people who had died. So securitization, in a way, I think is very similar to resilience. It's let's make ourselves fit for catastrophe. And it's very much in the minds of very many people who have lost the belief that these problems can be solved. So they're looking at, it's a little bit like geoengineering and climate change. You know, we're not going to stop climate change, so let's kind of shoot arrows at with different chemicals at clouds and come up with some bizarre small mirrors in the stratosphere that would reflect the sun, and all sorts of solutions like that. So this is very, very similar. The guru of resilience actually formulated it as growing stronger in an unpredictable world, which of course means that growing stronger is something that only a minority can achieve. So basically it's in German, rette sich wer kann. What's the English translation? Save yourself if you can. So this is the predominant, and you might think, why is he repeating this? But this is really the predominant attitudes of people with wealth and power. I would say it's a kind of utilitarian calculus of the possible within a framework that is against any form of radical change or any form of redistribution, therefore relying on security, on resilience, on marginalization. And the only thing that their projects can actually achieve is, in the best of cases, survival, but never good life. So there's a big difference between, in German it's more beautiful because you can make the play Überleben, Leben. It's all about Überleben, survival, and not about Leben or even gutes Leben, which is life, good life. One more thing that is quite new, and that is to us as, meanwhile, elderly gentlemen was really shocking, was that charity has changed as well. And it's actually changed in a similar way that aid has changed. That means charity has become a way of consumerism. So in a way, it's a parallel to aid becoming a way of profit-making. Charity becomes an aspect of consumerism. And if you look at the different websites, it's quite evident. You have a kind of charitainment. So it's all about, it's so much fun to enjoy life, and at the end of the day, something small is donated and something good is done. So it's number one about immediacy. It's very, very important. We have a lot of funny, not funny, grotesque stories in the book. Because Thomas, of course, has been in this business for many years, how actually the media pictures that you see are often, in terms of the practicability, complete nonsense. You know, like have doctors with stretchers running from an airplane towards people, you know, who've just, I don't know, been swallowed by a volcano or whatever. Often that particular picture makes no practical sense, but it's very, very good in establishing a sense of immediacy. By now donating, I'm actually, you know, helping these doctors run towards the victims. And this, of course, has been magnified by the internet and by social media. In a way, the click simulates a human touch. So you have kind of the visuality of suffering that's very immediate, and then through a certain click, you can allow yourself to believe that you've alleviated this particular suffering There's a wonderful German humorist who calls this Humanismus au chocolat. Humanismus au chocolat. So I would just suggest have a look at it on the internet. I'll just give you one example. It's called Share the Meal, and they claim they're the first app against global hunger. Another interesting thing is that the rhetoric is always grand when the solution is small. So you have people who are offering some kind of ridiculously small solution, and then it says, overcoming whatever, suffering, hunger, inequality, whatever it might be. So Share the Meal consists of you hosting a picture of your meal, and for being allowed to host a picture of your meal, you are then donating 40 cents to someone who needs a meal. So they happily announced that they've actually gathered 10 million, which of course is absolutely nothing. I mean, just Germany, you have the so-called Tafeln, which are places where poor Germans go and receive food. Food usually donated by the supermarkets, food whose expiry date has just passed, but you can still eat the stuff. So the 10 million would not even suffice to fund the Tafeln in Germany, which care for about, or cater to about 1.5 million people at the moment. But the interesting thing is that apparently this was not enough, so they donate the money to the World Food Programme, which is a drop in the ocean, 10 million in their budget. But so that was not enough, so they added another layer, which is actually called camera giving. And you're basically invited to indulge in the opulence of your consumerism, and it's all, you can see an endless assortment of beautiful pictures of what people have eaten, and then it says underneath every picture, what was it? Or with this picture you are helping someone who's hungry, or something like that. I've forgotten the exact words. So basically, visualizing, it's a very interesting, psychologically interesting concept. Visualizing opulence translates in some bizarre pathological way in the users and the people who set up this website, translates into overcoming hunger. So other things you can look at is ELA funds, a better world as a service, we're building something fresh. Or GoFundMe, which is called the digital safety net, or betterplace.org. Betterplace.org is really ridiculous if you've been around. It actually frames huge issues into small and very clearly understandable and clearly financially demarcated spaces. So it would say, crisis in South Sudan. And you think, okay, yeah, huge crisis, I know about it. We need $10,500. We've already reached, 82%. So we just need another 2,700, whatever it might be, dollars, and then crisis in Southern Sudan is solved. It's kind of an involuntary form of satire. So to finish off, a few positive notes, and I want to start off with a project in Nicaragua that was very, very impressive, which again came out of a huge catastrophe, which is actually something similar happened about a year ago. The flanks of volcanoes are often very eroded, which has to do with the fact that on lava, it's not a very deep soil, so whatever vegetation there is is easily destroyed, for example, by overgrazing or by overuse. And sometimes the whole flank kind of comes down. And this was the case in Nicaragua, and several villages were destroyed by this. Several thousand people died, and the survivors then had to rebuild their lives. And in this case, actually, the NGO that supported them was Medico. And again, what they did is they came up, or they started, the stepping stone was a sense of communality and solidarity. But they were aware of the fact that these peasants, who've always been peasants, also had a need for the personal in the individual. So they came up with plots of land with a small house and enough arable land around them for small gardens, which would be enough for sustainable agriculture, and at the same time, huge patches of land for cooperative, for the cooperative of the village. And the interesting thing is that this was so successful that the ruling party, as you know, Nicaragua has become a horrible dictatorship gradually. The ruling party is now trying to kind of dominate and to incorporate this successful cooperative. So when you look at the reasons why these things are successful, I just want to point out a few basic truths. One is there's always an element of self-organization, and you would be surprised how many projects are still not aware of the fact that empowerment starts actually with empowerment, very simple, which means the decision-making has to be handed over to the people involved. And I remember many, many years ago doing a story on a Norwegian architect in Dharavi, actually, in Bombay. So he was invited, he was like the star architect, and he was invited to come up with something that would be really innovative for this biggest slum in Asia, in Bombay. And he did something that astonished everybody. He actually said, I don't know how to build here. So he just, sat down and talked with the local people, who are actually all builders, because most of the buildings in the slum are kind of self-produced. And then with his expertise and with his technological skill, he actually translated traditional self-made, self-organized forms of architecture into something that is more stable, more livable, but still kind of is derived from the experience of local people. So self-organization and decision-making in the hands of local people. The second thing is globalization from below. There is actually a growing movement in different areas of globalization from below. For example, there's something called the People's Health Movement that is very, very successful worldwide. Certain members of this global initiative, for example, a big organization in Bangladesh, are extremely successful in setting up alternative ways for health services. The next aspect would be human rights literacy. Something I was not aware of before we researched this book. I think I've now become more attuned to the necessity for a kind of social, political, human rights literacy as, again, a foundation for activism. And the last thing, of course, is some form of social property, some form of commons. Interestingly enough, in all these societies we visited, the huge, huge majority of people we talked to, basically nearly everybody except a few, the chief or the political corrupt mobster, nearly everybody else was actually for social property. I think it's very interesting that we have this predominance of privatized property as kind of the only form of, the only guarantee of individual economic freedom, while most people, especially underprivileged, marginalized people, are much wiser than this neoliberal nonsense, and they're aware of the fact that we actually need social property, we need commons. We need common ground in order to have a society that's dignified in any way. I thank you very much for listening. Just want to point out one thing. If you do read German, there's an Austrian magazine called Wespennest, and we actually dedicated an issue on that subject, Hilfe. There's a wonderful article by a fellow of this institute, Ludger Hagedorn, in it, and many, many other articles on all forms of, on all aspects of this topic. So if you're interested, small recommendation. And I believe it's time for Q&A, or? Okay, thank you.
Thank you very much, Ilija. It is indeed time for a few quick questions. I will not try and summarize anything of the lecture to say, just two things. I think one of the things you point to is a very, very general phenomena, which is the fetishization of numbers, and what the fetishization of quantification, and what that has done not only to the development and aid sector, but I think to all social science. And I think this is a very serious problem which we need to discuss, what it means methodologically. I see Ruth is nodding. I think across disciplines, this is a major issue. And the other thing you point to in your critique of resilience, I think is very, very important, because it's not just about turning chickens into ducks, but it is about individualizing actually into personal characteristics of people what is actually a structural and societal problem. So that's part of the neoliberal move, is to say, let's look for what individualizes rather than enables us to find collective solutions. And that, with that, you come to the whole question of self-organization and commons. Just on a last note, the Institute will be doing a whole series of conferences, one every year, on rethinking the commons. So this has been something which has accompanied us through the last 2 years. We've already done one in Warsaw 2 years ago, and we start again this year with rethinking the commons. So this is very welcome. You will be invited. So thank you very, very much for a tour de force, and the floor is open.
Thank you, Shalini. The metaphor of turning chickens into ducks is a very, very challenging metaphor, particularly because, well, I wanted to say thank you very much for this very provocative presentation of positive and problematic examples in development aid. But I wanted to go back to this metaphor because ducks are in fact communal, as many of us have observed, and they're also very, very good at surviving with whatever is available to them. So I'd like, sorry? Very resilient, very resilient. And it's true, now I go back to the word resilience, because many development aid organizations and NGOs, I worked the last 10 years with Roma organizations in Central Europe, have used resilience as a mantra, sort of, in order to be able to say, yes, we will drive ourselves from below. And it was known in the 1980s as trickle-up development instead of trickle-down. So I'd like to know how you can use that metaphor of chickens into ducks as something that would be more positive and driving people forward, rather than looking at it as a negative example.
A couple of questions together.
Okay.
Franz.
Hello, Franz Früller from the Erste Foundation in Vienna. Thank you for the provocative thoughts. I wanted to point out two things and ask a question. It seems to me that most of the negative examples you brought were examples for how to raise funds. Philanthrocapitalism, the social bonds, the social impact investment, etc., or the charitainment that you mentioned. This is all about how to raise funds. And there I would take issue slightly with you. I think any means to pulling money out of the pockets of the fat, satisfied Europeans or North Americans is fine with me. And then I'm not sure where Medico gets his money or how it gets his money, for example, but I guess some charitainment is part of that as well. So I think the really interesting part is how the money is being used. Okay, with the philanthrocapitalism, how much money you are making on the backs of poor people. That can happen, but I think I could give you some examples where, also from Austria, where this is happening and the money being made is actually quite small or reasonable for the amount of money being provided through that sort of mechanism. The question that I have concerns the issue of the efficiency. You were talking about Fina, and you were talking about the different examples of libraries and giving €20 or $20 to a person. But the question I have here is, aren't both things necessary? Do we not need to give concrete economic aid that pays off economically in concrete figures, but at the same time, don't we also need to give Tolstoy? And how can this be combined? Do you have, in all the examples that you saw in the world, do you have an example where that combination of those two would work? Because I think we need both. And how can that come together?
Well, I like your idea of actually taking the metaphor on a completely different level, and that would be metamorphosis. So if the human were to become an animal, would it be better for him to be a chicken or a duck? And in that case, then of course, duck might actually be the preferable option. In a way, the question, of course, has a link to a subject that's been one of my kind of favorite preoccupations, and that is what forms of solidarity and empathy are written into natural behavior. And we know, of course, that especially the people who study apes and other primates have, in the last 2 decades, come across absolutely astounding proof that our closest relatives, in parentheses, in nature are not only capable but practice forms of empathy and solidarity and communal behavior on a regular basis. So I think that's a very, very intriguing question as to how far would a changing structure and a changing framework that's not defined by greed and individuality and so on and so forth, to what extent would kind of the duck-like behavior become predominant again? I'm not sure that answers your question, but you inspired me to think along these lines. I think to answer your question, I would, although this sounds slightly corny, I would actually have to ask you to read the book, because all these things are discussed, of course, with far more detail and far more depth in the book. Basically, I think we disagree on several levels. Number one is, I think the way you procure the money is linked to the way the money is used, and it's a question of democracy or not. So my major argument is that the power of philanthrocapitalism is anti-democratic. There's absolutely no justification, according to my convictions, that someone like Bill and Melinda Gates would have such enormous power. The same goes true for whether it's Bertelsmann or Rockefeller or Kellogg or whatever they're called. I think we prove in the book very clearly that they make policy decisions, and these policy decisions are one-sided. So my question is, why should they have, just because they're very good at milking the system or at making, let us assume the profit making was done in an honest fashion. I don't exactly know how, but let's be generous. How, just because they were good at either earning money or at procuring funds through all these forms of, as you said, charitable and so on, why should they be given such an allowance? Why should they become so dominant, both within in regard to policies as well as in regard to the public discourse? That would be my first question. The second question is that I think we all look at the efficiency of certain decisions. I think that's wired into our thinking. I mean, we don't want to be wasteful. So I think there's no need kind of to come up with an ideology of efficiency. I think the problem we have is that it's become a dogma. And of course, the first kind of guru of this movement was the philosopher Peter Singer from Australia. And when you read his book, it's about, he claims that he honestly wants to change the world, to make it a better place. It's 280 pages, and there's half a page on political change. So this is the major problem I have. If we truly want to solve problems of an enormity, of a catastrophic enormity, we have to think outside of the box. And thinking outside of the box means seriously challenging existing structural conditions, both economic, political, and others. If we don't have that, this is what we call the depolitization. If we basically think that by a little bit of aid here and there, and by making it extremely efficient, we can make a difference, I think that is the biggest illusion of all. And it's a self-serving illusion, because all these people, of course, are earning a good living and having a good time, kind of following this route. So I think this is the center of our argument. There cannot be any true aid without a framework of political discourse, in a free political discourse, in which the people most affected are given a voice to discuss and decide what they want. And this is not, I mean, none of the foundations, and we've looked at them very closely, none of them does that. Basically, it's all, you talked about trickle up, it's basically trickle down decision making, not economics. So it's become, I think it's become a dogma which is completely contaminated by economical thinking, as you called it, fetishization, economical thinking as kind of the highest form of truth. And this is something I'm completely opposed to. I think that it's, and I'm not only opposed to it on, let's say, ethical grounds or on because of other convictions, I'm opposed to it because, having traveled the world, I can see the effects of it, and the effects of it are absolutely devastating. So if this were successful, we could have this discussion, but it's not successful. It's exactly the opposite. Even though they've now been practicing efficiency for 5, 10, 15 years, there's absolutely no improvement, quite the opposite. When you look at all the different parameters of social economic development, you have actually an ongoing catastrophe in those regions that are left behind, particularly, of course, Africa, which we looked at very closely. So I think these are the things I would be quite careful, cautious, and passionate about.
Thank you very much. This was a truly wonderful lecture, and having a son who worked in development, it made me think of a lot of things which he told us. One of the things was he actually worked for the Gates Foundation for some time in a big project, as having done a master's on development, and he stopped, and he said the terrible thing was he suddenly became aware that it was a recolonization. So I would like to add that to your very thorough description. His impression was you're sent there you go around interviewing for 2 weeks, then you think you know everything about what those people want, then you go back and have to write a report. And that's how it works on the ground, not just sort of the money which is given by the PIs of these big projects, but what the people on the ground, the researchers, have to do. And he was extraordinarily frustrated that you don't know the languages and you need translators, you have no clue what they translate. So that on many, many levels it's very deficient, also in this micromanagement. So I just wanted to add that to the way you described that. I have two questions, small questions. The one is, you said that this aid now is being described in such negative terms. And looking at recent discourse in Austria and elsewhere, we have this enormous negative rhetoric against the NGOs, specifically in relationship to rescuing refugees in the Mediterranean. So that, of course, affects in many ways how NGOs are being viewed. I think it's terrible, but I would like to know what you think one could also do against that negative reinforcement of this image. And that NGOs, which, I mean, I've never studied them, but I think they're good, like Médecins Sans Frontières, they're really affected in very negative ways. And the second question, what does one do when the states stop funding aid? Which is happening, they're cutting aids. I remember the discussion in the UK about why should we fund development? We should invest at home. You have it here as well. So what if the philanthropists then jump in? Yeah, it also makes sense. So I think there's a dilemma. So I would be interested what you comment on that.
Oh yeah, I mean there are many dilemmas. Well, first on the personal note, what you said about your son, I actually think in this case it helps to be a novelist, because as a novelist you realize that regardless of how much I do research, I will never know as much as the local fisherman about the world he lives in. So with all my education and with all my insights and all my technical skills, I will always be, if I'm writing about a different place, a different culture, so on, different context, I will always be not more than a limited child. And in my case, this was a very important development, because I realized that in a way there's only one way of overcoming this deficiency, and that is gathering voices. Therefore kind of transforming the solo of the voice of the author into a choir. And therefore doing things like, which I've now been practicing for a long time, asking local people to describe what they see, because what they actually see is different from what I see. So in a way, I think it's a hubris which your son described, which we came across time and again, that there is a kind of a shortcut to salvation. And there is no shortcut to salvation. So there is absolutely no way for someone from the outside, regardless of how much time he spends there, to know more than the local people. And therefore, that particular solution, I think, is very, very simple. Just leave it to them. On your question, I mean, those are huge dilemmas, because we talk to many people who, are, to put it very bluntly, good people. So who say, these are important projects, and exactly as you said, there's no other funding available. So many of the people who actually want to change something are caught up in this dilemma. Nevertheless, most of the people that we talk to always explain that the economic, the financial aspect of whatever they're doing is just one part of it. And that if this is not accompanied by what I called, for example, human rights literacy, of forms of communication, of interactioning, if there's not an element of cultural empowerment, of respect, of uplifting people, of enabling them to find new dignity. So all these things that are not describable in numbers and in economic terms, if that is not part of your setup, if that's not part of your project, then the whole thing is not worth doing. So in a way, all serious people that we talk to recognize the limitations of a purely material approach. There has to be something, to put it kind of now in very Indian terms, there has to be something spiritual about it as well, which means, of course, discovering the common ground of human interaction, of empathy, of sharing, and so on and so forth. Now, sharing is interesting because sharing itself has become a victim of economization. So you have all this sharing economy. And the interesting thing is that this also pertains to what the gentleman just previously asked. The interesting thing is that when you talk to people who work for the Gates Foundation, I did a book once with a colleague called Ilija on mass surveillance, and we were very critical, and we were invited by Google. The interesting thing was that these Google people actually seriously think that they're doing good. They're completely convinced that they're doing good. And the same is true of all these people we met, whether it's philanthropists. So I think the dilemma is partly Dr. Jekyll, Mr. Hyde dilemma. And this is also very much true for EU policies, that in a way we have an inclination and a rhetoric of the positive, the universal. We are aware of human rights. We would love for them to be valid throughout the world. And yet in our practice, we are unfaithful to a lot of these aspects. And I think so it's I would say, linking it also to the concept of imperiale Lebensweise, so imperial mode of living, it's a dilemma that it is in each one of us. By not being able to kind of overcome, I would say, certain limitations of our epoch, certain limitations of thinking, of language, and so on and so forth. And therefore, the whole book was kind of an exercise in also questioning, let's say, the comfort levels within this discourse. Because part of the problem is that people then come up with certain solutions that are put in place, and then in a way they become automatisms of interaction and activity. And one of the big questions is, where does the questioning happen? I mean, what kind of spaces are available for a radical reconsideration or reevaluation of what is happening? And that is something that's completely missing in many instances. This was a very interesting thing we found out, that there's actually no level in which, sorry?
No level of self-criticism.
No level of self-criticism or communal kind of discursive criticism. So, no, the dilemma is a huge problem, and I wouldn't dare to have a solution at the moment.
So I have several questions. Eva, I'll start with you.
We brief Eva Tanasov, a recent fellow and woman. I wanted to press you on your political solution, because I'm wondering to what the containing aid into an economic sphere is actually a more decent thing to do, in the sense that it's less invasive, and even though it may be imperial, it's less imperial than to propose to come in with aid and reshape society completely, as you pointed out with the polio example. To fix the health system, you need to fix the whole society, the way people relate to each other, the institutions, bottom up, top down. So what you seem to be proposing is we come in with a revolutionary advance guard, sort of politicize everybody and lead them on the barricades. But that seems to me, I mean, I like the spirit and the radicalism. I'm not sure that will be any more successful, but it seems to me that if any country is considering receiving aid of that kind, very few would say yes. Yeah, so I'm wondering to what extent all these foundations have to contain themselves, limit themselves, in order to be accepted at all, given that all this aid is happening within the framework of sovereign nation states to some degree or other.
I must have spoken very unclearly, because I actually thought I said the exact opposite, that there's absolutely no intention, and none of the projects we described consists of people from outside coming in and bringing solutions. What I described is local communities with local activists developing radical solutions. So no, I would be completely against any form of neo-colonial or neo-imperial intervention.
But if they could do it, why aren't they doing it, right?
Well, we describe projects where they are doing it. I'm sure you're aware of things like police, army, mafia, oligarchy, corruption, and about 100 other things that, you know, people get killed in these places very often just for protesting. People get killed in these places just for trying to build a bridge because they didn't pay enough money to the local gangster or the local politician. So all these communities that we describe are actually leading, it's a form of civil war. They're leading an existential fight to be allowed the freedom to construct what they're constructing. So the forces against that are enormous. I mean, forces of repression, violence, and exploitation are huge, and these are simple local people. So it's actually a miracle that they've managed to come up with these kind of niches of successful transformative development. But no, I can assure you that I would never, never, ever suggest that anybody, not even myself, go in and offer solutions. No, I'm all for local solutions. And what I described in the health movement is actually exactly that. So the People's Health Movement is actually people from all these countries that are trying to develop inclusive, wide-ranging health systems in their countries, exactly as you said, which means a transformation of the whole society. And they're interlinking each other to share expertise, know-how, connections, and so on, also sometimes to finance or support one another. And this has been hugely successful. I mean, I don't have enough time to describe it, but for example, Bangladesh, it's something that caters now to millions of people and has really constructed a health service from below with thousands of so-called health promoters really dedicating their lives towards an underpaid or not at all paid health activism. So they're actually very positive examples in that regard.
Well, my name is Rubina Möhring. I'm a journalist and head of Reporters Without Borders here in Austria. I would like to come back to Europe, or let's say to the Western world, and to the human rights literacy you mentioned already. So shouldn't we try to develop the knowledge on human rights as well in our countries here? I mean, well, just look to the situation here in Austria. Look what the Minister for Interior Affairs said about human rights, and that politics is more important than the right. So I think we should start in our societies as well. And we should go to schools as well to teach them what human rights are and how important they are to live in a democratic country. We are going to, I got the impression we are living in a time of backlash to authoritarian systems because our countries are quite rich now. And yesterday my daughter, she's a therapist, she told me, but you know, Mommy, sometimes I got the feeling freedom and human rights is something for post-war societies when people are suffering and longing for freedom again. But when they got the freedom, they start to forget it. So I think we are a problem ourselves too.
Hi, thank you very much for your presentation. I'm Anka Kretso and I'm a junior fellow here. I was wondering a little bit about the agency within the recipient countries. And when talking about these philanthropists, they actually believe they're doing right because they do have these interlocutors in these recipient countries. To what extent do these interlocutors, whether it's a government, whether it's a local NGO through which they work with, enable their outreach and their language within that trickle-down process of assistance? Thank you.
Ivan Vejvoda, a permanent fellow here at the Institute. Thank you very much for a fascinating presentation and raising all the dilemmas. This is just a brief comment from someone who was engaged in this kind of work in the neighborhood starting at the Renveg, the Balkans. And I worked, full disclosure, for George Soros for 4 years. I led the foundation in what was still called Yugoslavia, and then for a private-public partnership that was American, called the Balkan Trust for Democracy, that covered Bulgaria, Romania, and the rest. And I would simply like to endorse some of your key points. And it was interesting that you used, in fact, the words of Hannah Arendt. People first need to know that they have the right to have rights, from her famous Origins on Totalitarianism. And if I were to boil down our work, which was far from perfect, but it was exactly that. The interesting thing is that these two organizations for which I worked empowered us local people and asked us what were the key things, that we were not served an agenda of what we were supposed to do. And thus, what we did, very simply put, maybe oversimply, to give voice to these people, to put them together after the conflict in Yugoslavia, for example, or to help them meet their Bulgarian, Romanian, Albanian, Greek, and other friends, and to develop programs of their own, both teenagers, but also helping journalists, and empowering, basically, the civic voice through, for example, sponsoring Freedom of Information Acts, and how you go and actually control and make your government responsible. Far from successful, of course, as we see the developments that we have, but I would say we've put a brick or two in the wall, which is a base from which one can go further. And thus, I would say, again, within this European context, there was a limited amount of success, but most of all, giving the consciousness of what it is to be a free citizen. Thank you.
Okay, so can we do? Yeah, you're absolutely right, but that was not the theme of the book, so that's kind of another topic. But I personally, I'm again Thursday. I'm going to Wiener Neustadt to spend 2 hours with kids in schools. I do that actually quite often because I think one of the important things to do is actually to talk to people when they're still very young. And what you actually do find out in schools, for example, in Austria, is that the level of political education is appalling. When you actually ask them quite simple things, and talking about people who are 15, 16, 17, they haven't a clue. So you're absolutely right, yeah, human rights and political literacy has to start at home, and we have a lot of work to do. To answer your question, that's a very, very interesting question, because that was discussed by nearly everybody we met in Mexico, because of course Mexico, being in the neighborhood of the US, has a lot of experience. And many people said exactly that in a way the local interlocutors kind of mirror towards the American donors what they would like to hear and see. Which reminded me very much, because I spent a lot of time studying 19th century colonialism for different books. Very much similar when you look at the indirect rule in India, or when you look at the different kind of paradigm chiefs and other local people of authority that were installed by the colonial powers. I think they were very good at basically mistranslating reality and feeding kind of the people in power and with the wealth the kind of information that they wanted to hear. So, which is why actually we met in Mexico more than in other countries quite a number of people who found that the only way they could deal with this issue is by leaving the NGOs. About half a dozen actually. It was quite evident that in a way you are forced to play a game that you don't want to be part of. So, but that's a huge issue. I think that's fascinating. That would be a very interesting theme for a topic. Or sorry, no. I just wanted to say one thing, because I was thinking a lot about the Balkans when I was in Guatemala, and I think part of what we're discussing has to do with how do we look at the past, and to what extent is the past wrested from the grips of the continuation of the elites, which in the country I know very well, which is called Bulgaria, is one of the major problems. So one solution is revolution. That didn't happen. The other solution is the Guatemalan solution, which is quite actually encouraging. The activists occupied the archive of the police force, and because it was a time of upheaval, it was kind of an open space that they used, and they started organizing the material, and they started digitalizing it with the help, and that's, I think, really, really very meaningful financial help by, I think, from Switzerland, from the US, and from Sweden or Netherlands. And because the archive was no longer in the hands of the police and no longer in the hands of the perpetrators of enormous crimes during the military rule in Guatemala, they could actually supply the public prosecutors who were trying to bring different generals to court. They could supply them with a very well-researched kind of panorama of crimes. When you add to that certain forensic studies that were done by professionals who were invited to the country in mass graves, you actually ended up having a society which, more than any other society in Latin America, had to come to terms with the horror and the violence of the past, and more people were sent to jail, even the former president, than in any other post-dictatorship that I know of. So that for me was a very interesting thing. You have to also look at the past and how can you actually, how can you gain democratic control over the archives or other representations of the past. And Guatemala, again, was a positive example.
It's very late. I will try to be short. In the last months, we have had a lot of critical reports on Chinese development policy. And I'm interested if you came in contact with a Chinese model of development and aid, and to what extent this mode of developing, this idea of development, is to some extent similar or differs from the Western one at the moment. And the second question is very, very short. You made a strong accent on the social issue, common property, solidarity, from low to up. What's with ecology and sustainability with regard to the project you have described positively, but also to the problematic way of projecting?
I think that's quite easy to answer. I think for anybody who has studied these issues, it's well known that the local people have more knowledge about ecology and the complexities of their particular ecological kind of nexus, and that basically the way they lived was to a certain degree sustainable, while the ecological catastrophe comes in with huge investments. So basically when you're looking at countries like Guatemala, or I was in September in Borneo, where huge areas of rainforest have been destroyed, and now you have monocultures of palm oil. That's the kind of big investment that, you know, part of our system proclaims as being progressive and necessary. But that is the most radical form of ecological destruction that you could possibly imagine. And it was actually very moving because Thomas, with whom I traveled, had traveled through North Guatemala exactly the same route 30 years ago. And he had in his head the memory of rainforest throughout. And now it was 80 kilometers of palm oil plantation. And if you've never seen that, it's really something that cannot be described. It's the complete and utter monotony. And when you then read that after about 30 years the soil will be depleted, you know, or I can say that the local people wouldn't have voted for something like that. I mean, this is in combination with land grabbing, with corruption, with the interests of multinationals, and so on and so forth. So I would say the ecological...
Some jobs, isn't it?
Very, very few actually, very few. In industrial agriculture, there are very few jobs. You're looking at, but even in mining, even in a poor country like Sierra Leone, it's mostly automatized. Meanwhile, so you're looking at Koido City, a city of several 100,000 people, and you're looking at about 100 people working in the mining, in the mines, and the mines have completely destroyed the whole area. It's actually nearly every building is half destroyed because of weekly explosions, dynamite, and there's dust over everything. So the argument of jobs is, I think, a ridiculous one. I mean, the same with the jobs in argument in Germany and Austria. We produce weapons and jobs, and then it's 30 to 40,000 jobs in Germany. So for 30 to 40,000 jobs, we're prepared to sell out any form of humanism. It's, I mean, I don't think that's even worth discussing. It's so ridiculously demonic as an argument. But the other question, China, yeah. The other question is very interesting because this is, of course, a very hypocritical discourse, because what the Chinese do is very similar what, let's say, the French did until recently, but the Chinese are cheaper. So I remember being in Mali a few years back, and then someone told me exactly the same thing. He said, no, I mean, we're not naive. The Chinese are also here to exploit us. But you know what? The Chinese guy is 10 times cheaper than the French guy. So at least they're not going to exploit us as much as the French. So in a way, that the Chinese policy is on many levels a continuation of Western imperial, colonial, and post-colonial policies. There's only one difference. They're also not liked at all. They're not liked at all because they live in ghettos. And of course, since it's a totalitarian surveillance state, they are very cautious of interacting with other people. Very similar to until '89, for example, in Nicaragua, an old man told me that it was actually hilarious that until '89, the East Germans and the West Germans in Nicaragua would actually try to avoid one another to an extent that they would cross the road if they saw, if you know the East German saw a West German coming, he would cross the road just to make sure that no one could accuse him of interacting with the enemy. But the one interesting thing about the Chinese intervention in Africa is that actually they are constructing incredibly efficient public works and infrastructure projects. I mean, what they've built now from the Red Sea to Addis Ababa, the train route. The only thing connecting Tanzania with Zambia until recently was the so-called Tazara, Tanzania-Zambian Railways, which the Chinese built. And so, of course, they have their own interest. I mean, they're not doing it for the good of Tanzania or any other country. But on the other hand, some of these projects have been extremely useful in terms of, connecting the country and enabling then other things. Just to finish with an anecdote, since I'm a novelist after all, no one told the Chinese that far less people live in Tanzania than in China, which is why they actually brought the plans. They didn't come up with new plans for the construction of railway stations in Tanzania and Zambia. They took their Chinese plans with them, which is why in the middle of nowhere in Tanzania, you have railway stations where you could fit in like 10,000 people, like 200 meters long and 50 meters broad. And there are like 2 people in there, and it's absolutely wonderful. You could like house 2 soccer pitches in the railway line. So I think the Chinese need to be informed about the dimensions of development. Okay, well, thanks a lot. And
thank you for inspiring.
Have a good
Ilija. Thank you very, very much for a wide-ranging discussion. I'm sorry some of you had questions, but I was a bad timekeeper. We are long overdue for two things. One, there is good wine and cheese downstairs, but equally important, there is also the opening of the exhibition of paintings which are all along the staircase, and we are going to have a few words on these paintings. This is the vernissage by Nina Schädelmeier of Profile. May I request you to just do that downstairs at the Wine and Cheese, because there are people who are outside who are there for the vernissage and have probably missed the lecture because we had no room here. So maybe it's better over a glass of wine and cheese downstairs in a minute. Thank you very much for doing it. Thanks a lot, Ilija, for reminding us that development aid is an anti-politics machine, as James Ferguson's book title showed. But I think what is really, really fascinating about your talk for me was that the human rights, which have received such a bad press, also from the left, suddenly all of us are beginning to become defenders of human rights when it comes to defending them against the caritative approach to aid. So I think there needs to be a constituency for the development, for the defense of human rights, and I think you've made a very strong case for that tonight, and especially for rights-based approaches to empowerment rather than either state-led or philanthropic. So I think there is a very important lesson to be learned from all of the examples, the positive ones. And with that, I would like to just announce one thing, which is IWM will do with Ilija and a few other project partners a whole year of projects, talks, discussions, workshops on the idea of utopia. So we're going to follow the positive utopias. We're going to forget a lot. The new narratives, because we felt otherwise things could get very depressing. So it's time to look at the positive aspects of some of the developments we've been talking about, and you're welcome. We'll advertise everything on the website, of course. So thank you for being with us tonight. There's wine and cheese downstairs and the opening of the exhibition. Thank you.